The year is 1951. The location is the jagged, frozen airspace above the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. This is the alley, MiG Alley. For the pilots of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, specifically the elite veterans of World War II who have been secretly deployed to this theater, the sky is supposed to be their domain. They are flying the MiG-15 fighter, a machine that shocked the Western world when it first appeared. It is a silver arrow, swept-winged and predatory. On paper, and in the visceral reality of vertical combat, it is superior to anything the Americans can put in the air. It climbs faster, it flies higher. It carries heavy 37mm cannons capable of tearing a bomber apart with a single hit. Against them are the Americans in their F-86 Sabre fighters. The Sabre is a beautiful machine, yes, but historically, in this specific moment, it is underpowered compared to the Soviet jet. It cannot climb with the MiG-15 aircraft. It cannot reach the same service ceiling. The laws of physics and aerodynamics dictate the rules of engagement here. If a Soviet pilot finds himself in trouble, all he has to do is pull back on the stick and climb. He can ascend into the thin air where the American jets stall and gasp, leaving the Sabre fighters helplessly watching from below. It is a sanctuary in the sky, a tactical advantage that should guarantee dominance. But on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, the impossible happens. And it begins with a feeling of profound confusion that will ripple all the way back to Moscow. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, a man who will go on to become the top ace of the conflict, is leading a flight of 4 MiG-15 aircraft on a patrol sweep. The weather is clear, visibility is unlimited. Below them, the rugged terrain of Korea looks like crumpled brown paper. Sutyagin spots a formation of American Sabres far below, perhaps 5,000 feet down. This is the perfect setup. The Soviet doctrine is clear: dive, strike with heavy cannons, and use the superior climb rate to zoom back up to safety before the Americans can retaliate. It is a boom and zoom tactic that relies on energy retention. Sutyagin signals the attack. The 4 silver jets roll over and dive. The speed builds rapidly 600 miles per hour, then 650. The airframe shudders, compressing against the sound barrier. They scream down upon the American formation. The Sabres break hard, scattering like a flock of startled birds. Sutyagin picks his target, lines up the crude optical sight, and fires. The heavy cannons thump, sending tracers arcing through the sky. He misses, the deflection angle too steep, the closing speed too high. It does not matter. He has the energy. He pulls back hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The MiG-15 responds, its Klimov engine roaring as it converts that speed back into altitude. He shoots upward, expecting to see the American Sabre falling away below him, unable to follow. But when he looks back, the Sabre is not falling away. It is following. This makes no sense to the Soviet veteran. The Sabre is heavier, it has less thrust, it should be bleeding energy, stalling out. Yet, the American pilot is hanging on. But the real shock comes a split second later. Sutyagin is now thousands of feet away, twisting in a high G climb, presenting a small, difficult target. At this range, hitting a maneuvering jet with machine guns is statistically impossible. The human eye cannot judge the lead distance accurately. The vibration of the aircraft, the wind drift, the bullet drop, the variables, are too complex for a human brain to calculate in a fraction of a second. And yet tracers flash past his canopy. They are not wild spray and pray shots. They are terrifyingly accurate. A stream of 50 caliber rounds slams into the wing of his wingman's jet. Smoke erupts. The hit was precise, surgical, achieved from a distance and an angle that defies the known limitations of aerial gunnery. Sutyagin watches in horror as his wingman spirals down. He is not angry yet. He is bewildered. He knows the capabilities of the Browning machine guns the Americans use. He knows the effective range. That shot should not have happened. It was a ghost bullet. A lucky shot, perhaps? A 1 in a million alignment of chance? He aborts the mission, diving back toward the sanctuary of the Chinese border airfields. His heart is pounding, not from the exertion of the fight, but from the uncanny feeling that the rules of the game have changed without anyone telling him. Back on the ground at the Antung airfield, the mood is chaotic. Other pilots are landing, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they light cigarettes. It was not just Sutyagin. Across the sector, Soviet pilots are reporting the same inexplicable phenomenon. They are engaging the Americans, they are using their superior vertical performance to escape, and they are getting hit. Ground crews swarm the damaged MiG-15 aircraft that managed to limp home. They examine the bullet holes. They are grouped tightly. This is the hallmark of a sniper, not a dogfighter spraying lead in a desperate turn. To achieve a grouping like that on a target, moving at 600 miles per hour while pulling 4Gs, requires a level of marksmanship that does not exist. No amount of training at the Soviet flight academies prepared them for this. Debriefing officers demand answers. "Did you slow down?" they ask. "Did you fly straight and level?" "No," the pilots insist. "We were maneuvering, we were climbing, we were outside their effective range." The political officers, the commissars attached to the unit to ensure loyalty, are suspicious. They suspect cowardice or incompetence. They cannot accept that the American equipment is performing impossible feats. They accuse the pilots of letting the Americans get too close. But the veterans know what they saw. They saw tracers curving into them from distances where the American plane was just a speck. It is as if the American bullets are guided by an invisible hand. Before we unravel the investigation that consumed the Soviet High Command, if you want to understand the hidden technologies and secret histories that defined the 20th century, make sure you are subscribed to the channel Cold War Impact. We dig into the archives to bring you the stories the history books often leave out. The sun sets over the Yalu, but the lights in the command bunkers burn late into the night. The stakes could not be higher. You must understand the position of the Soviet Union at this moment in history. It is 1951. The world is balancing on the razor's edge of nuclear annihilation. Stalin is still alive, and his paranoia is at its peak. The war in Korea is a proxy war, a testing ground. If the Americans can dominate the air over Korea, it means their bombers can penetrate Soviet airspace. It means that the vast, expensive air defense network the Soviet Union is building, relying heavily on the MiG-15 aircraft, might be fundamentally flawed. The MiG-15 was their ace in the hole. It was the surprise that was supposed to level the playing field against Western numbers. If the Americans have found a way to swat them out of the sky with ease, despite the MiG's aerodynamic superiority, then the balance of power has shifted catastrophically. Reports begin to trickle up the chain of command all the way to Moscow. The language in these reports is guarded, fearful. No one wants to be the bearer of bad news to Stalin. They describe aggressive American tactics. They describe unusually high accuracy. But between the lines, the panic is palpable. The loss rates are climbing. In the early months of the war, the appearance of the MiG-15 had forced the American B-29 bombers to stop flying in daylight. It had terrified the US Air Force. But now, week by week, the F-86 Sabre pilots are clawing back the advantage. They are racking up kills that defy the performance charts of their aircraft. A terrifying theory begins to take root in the mess halls of Antung. The pilots whisper it to each other. They say the Americans have developed a new weapon. Maybe it is a proximity fuse for their machine gun bullets. Maybe it is a new type of super-velocity ammunition that travels so fast it requires almost no lead calculation. Or perhaps, and this is the most chilling thought, they have developed a way to control their aircraft that the Soviets simply do not understand. Every time a Soviet pilot climbs into his cockpit now, the confidence is gone. The arrogance of the superior machine has evaporated. They look at the sky and see a trap. They know that if they make a single mistake, if they enter the zone of the Sabre, they will be destroyed by that uncanny robotic accuracy. The zone, that is what they start to call it. It is an invisible sphere around the American jets. If you enter it, you die. It doesn't matter if you are faster. It doesn't matter if you can climb higher. If you are in the zone, the Americans don't miss. General Georgy Lobov, commander of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, is under immense pressure. Moscow wants results. They want dead Americans and safe Soviet pilots. Instead, Lobov is writing letters of condolence and watching his best men vanish into the hillsides of Korea. He orders a change in tactics. "Get closer," he demands. "Do not fire until you can see the rivets." He thinks the problem is Soviet marksmanship. He thinks his pilots are firing from too far away, while the Americans are showing better discipline. He is wrong. The confusion reaches a breaking point when a highly experienced flight leader, a man with combat experience against the Luftwaffe, engages a lone Sabre. The fight is a vertical rolling scissors, a complex, nauseating maneuver where two planes spiral around each other, trying to force the other to overshoot. The Soviet pilot executes the maneuver perfectly. He forces the Sabre out in front. But as he pulls the trigger, his shells go wide. The optical sight in his MiG-15 is bouncing, vibrating. He has to guess the lead. He guesses wrong. The Sabre reverses. It defies the energy state it should be in. It pulls its nose around with sluggish heaviness, yet it points directly at the MiG. The Soviet pilot brakes hard, pulling 5 Gs, knowing he is safe. The deflection is too high. Then, the tracers arrive. They stitch a line across his fuselage, severing the hydraulic lines. The controls go dead. As he ejects, tumbling into the freezing slipstream, he watches the Sabre fly away. It didn't spray bullets. It fired a short 2-second burst. And every single bullet seemed to find him. This was not luck. This was a system. The Soviets realize they are fighting a ghost. They are fighting something they cannot see, something hidden inside the metal skin of the F-86 Sabre. And until they find out what it is, the slaughter in MiG Alley will continue. The mystery is no longer just a tactical problem. It is a strategic emergency. The Kremlin gives the order, find out how they are doing it. Find out why they don't miss. The hunt for the answer begins. But the investigators are looking in all the wrong places. They are looking for a new gun. They are looking for a new engine. They have no idea that the secret lies in something far smaller and far more complex than they are capable of imagining. The mystery has now moved from the high-altitude freeze of the stratosphere to the muddy, frozen ground of North Korea. The hunt is on. The Soviet Union mobilizes its technical intelligence apparatus with a ferocity usually reserved for nuclear secrets. Special recovery teams are formed. These are not ordinary infantry. They are groups of engineers and intelligence officers from the GRU, accompanied by Chinese security forces. Their orders are explicit and carry the weight of a death sentence for failure. Bring us a Sabre. Every time an F-86 goes down, which is rare, these teams scramble. They race against American combat search and rescue helicopters, often under heavy artillery fire, trying to reach the smoking craters before the Americans can bomb the wreckage into dust. The Americans know they have something to hide. When a Sabre crashes behind enemy lines, US Navy Corsairs and Sky Raiders are often dispatched immediately to strafe and napalm the crash site. They burn their own technology to ash rather than let it fall into Soviet hands. This scorched earth policy only deepens the Soviet paranoia. What are they protecting? In the deep winter of 1951, a Soviet recovery team manages a breakthrough. An F-86 Ampere Sabre crashes in the tidal flats near the coast. The mud extinguishes the fire. The pilot ejects and is rescued by an American helicopter, but the machine remains. The tide comes in, hiding the prize from American spotter planes. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of Chinese laborers and Soviet advisors drag the broken carcass of the jet out of the muck. They haul it onto a flatbed truck, cover it with hay, and drive it north, crossing the Yalu River into the sanctuary of Manchuria. It is immediately loaded onto a train bound for Moscow, specifically for the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute and the Secret Weapons Bureaus. The dissection begins. Soviet engineers swarm the aircraft like surgeons. They strip the skin panels. They remove the engine. But the ballistics experts go straight for the nose. They want to see the guns. They want to see the magic weapon that is swatting their MiG-15 aircraft out of the sky. What they find is disappointing. They pull out 6 Browning M3 machine guns. They disassemble them on the sterile white tables of the laboratory. They measure the barrel rifling. They test the spring tension. They analyze the metallurgy of the firing pins. The report that lands on Stalin's desk is baffling. These are not superweapons. They are essentially the same 50 caliber machine guns the Americans used in World War II, slightly sped up to fire 1,200 rounds per minute. They are crude. They rely on kinetic energy. They are not explosive shells like the 37mm monsters on the MiG-15. The Soviet engineers are confused. "This is it?" they ask. "This is what is killing us." They analyze the ammunition. Standard ball, tracer, and incendiary rounds. No proximity fuses, no guidance chips, no secret propellants. If the gun is primitive and the bullet is dumb, then the magic must be in the aiming. Attention shifts to the cockpit. The canopy is shattered and the instrument panel is damaged from the impact and the saltwater corrosion. But sitting atop the dashboard, mounted prominently behind the armored glass, is a black box, a sight. The technicians pry it loose. It is labeled on centimeter. To the untrained eye, It looks like a standard optical reflector sight, a piece of glass where a reticle is projected, similar to what the Germans used, similar to what the Soviets themselves use in the MiG-15. But when they open the casing, they find a density of wiring and vacuum tubes that looks less like a gun sight and more like a miniature computer. It is packed with delicate gyroscopes, magnetic amplifiers, and a complex web of circuitry. However, the unit is smashed. The delicate internal gimbals, the spinning tops that keep the gyro stable, are crushed by the G-forces of the crash. The vacuum tubes are broken glass. The Soviets can see what it is, but they cannot make it work. They cannot power it up to see the ghost that their pilots are reporting. They try to reverse engineer the schematic. They realize this sight is connected to a small intake on the nose of the jet. A radar. Radar ranging, the chief engineer mutters. They are using radar to get the distance. This is a significant finding, but it leads them to a dangerous and wrong conclusion. The Soviets assume that the radar simply tells the pilot how far away the target is, perhaps adjusting the size of the reticle. They have similar concepts on the drawing board, but a range-finding radar does not explain the lead, the ability to predict where the MiG will be in 2 seconds. The investigation turns to the pilots themselves. In the grim interrogation rooms of North Korean prison camps, captured American pilots are brought in. These men are tired, wounded, and terrified. The Soviet interrogators, speaking through translators or in broken English, don't ask about troop movements or nuclear codes initially. They ask about the box. "How do you aim?" the interrogator demands. "Do you use the rudder? Do you calculate the deflection manually?" The American pilots, often strictly briefed to say nothing about the A-series sights, play dumb. Or, truthfully, they admit they don't really know how it works. "I just put the pipper on the target and pull the trigger," one pilot says. This infuriates the Soviets. "Liar," they scream. "At 600 miles per hour, if you put the pipper on the target, the bullets will pass behind him. You must lead. How do you calculate the lead?" "I don't," the American insists. "The box does it. The box does it." This phrase filters back to the Kremlin. The box does it. The legend grows. In the mess halls of the Soviet air bases, the pilots begin to mythologize the American technology. They stop calling it a gun sight. They call it the electronic brain. Rumors fly wild. One theory posits that the Americans have connected the radar directly to the flight controls. They believe that once the American pilot locks onto a MiG, the F-86 Sabre flies itself. It becomes a robot assassin. They believe the American pilot is just a passenger, there to press the button when the light turns red. This theory is terrifying because it removes the human element. You can outfly a man, you can trick a man, you can scare a man, but you cannot scare a gyroscope. You cannot trick a calculator. Another theory suggests the electronic brain can see in the dark and through clouds. This leads to panic during bad weather. Soviet pilots, who would normally feel safe in heavy cloud cover, now feel naked. They imagine the American radar eyes piercing the fog, calculating the kill solution while they are blind. The Soviet leadership, desperate for a countermeasure, orders their own industry to copy the technology. They look at their own gun sight, the ASP-1 Newton. It is a copy of a British wartime design. It is a gyro sight, yes, but it is slow. When a Soviet pilot turns hard, the reticle in his sight lags behind. It wobbles. It takes 2 or 3 seconds to settle. In a dogfight, 2 seconds is an eternity. By the time the Soviet sight settles, the target is gone. They assume the American sight must have the same limitations. Physics is physics after all. Gyroscopes drift. They wobble. So, the Soviet analysts conclude that the Americans must be flying differently to accommodate the sight. They issue a new directive to their pilots. The Americans must fly smooth to use their sight. If you fly erratically, their electronic brain will get confused and tumble. This becomes the doctrine. Shake the saber. Fly wild, violent, unpredictable maneuvers to crash their computer. It creates a tragic irony. By flying wild, energy-bleeding maneuvers, the Soviet pilots are actually making themselves easier targets. They are bleeding off their speed, their one true advantage to try and confuse a computer that they don't understand. They don't realize that the American sight doesn't need them to fly smoothly. They don't realize that the specific innovation inside that black box is designed to handle exactly the kind of chaos they are creating. Back in Moscow, the pressure cooker explodes. Stalin is furious. The loss ratios are unacceptable. For every American Sabre shot down, the Soviets are losing too many MiGs. The precise ratio is a closely guarded secret, but the trend is undeniable. The investigation reaches a stalemate. They have the wreckage, but it's too smashed to function. They have the pilots, but they are tight-lipped or ignorant of the engineering. They have the theories, but they are based on fear, not fact. They are convinced the F-86 Sabre is a robot plane. They view it as a triumph of American electronic wizardry over Soviet aerodynamic purity. It creates a complex of inferiority that will haunt the Soviet military for decades. They become obsessed with electronics and automation, believing they are decades behind. In reality, they are looking at a mechanical marvel, not just an electronic one. As 1952 rolls around, the air war changes. The Americans introduce a new version of the Sabre, the F-86 Farads, and with it, the mystery deepens. The kills become even cleaner. The distances increase. The Soviets are now fighting a defensive war. They stop aggressive patrolling, they stay high, refusing to come down into the zone unless absolutely necessary. The MiG alley, that was supposed to be a slaughterhouse for American bombers, has become a trap for Soviet fighters. But the true nature of the device remains elusive. The Soviets are convinced it is a radar-guided autopilot. They are preparing to spend billions of rubles developing a counter-radar system, a jammer, to blind the F-86. They are about to waste years of research chasing the wrong ghost, because the secret isn't just in the radar. The secret is in a small, spinning component that solves the hardest math problem in aerial combat, instantly. And while the Soviets are looking for complex electronics, the Americans are winning with a piece of brilliant, analog engineering that is happening right under their noses. While Soviet generals were screaming at their pilots to fly more aggressively, and while KGB agents were sifting through charred wreckage in the frozen mud of Korea, the answer to the mystery was sitting calmly on a laboratory workbench in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was not a weapon forged in the fires of the Manhattan Project. It was not an alien technology recovered from a crash site. It was a math problem, solved by a genius who understood that the human brain had reached its evolutionary limit. The source of the ghost in MiG Alley was the instrumentation laboratory at MIT, led by a man named Dr. Charles Stark Draper. Doc Draper was not a fighter pilot. He was an engineer who looked at war as a series of equations. He understood something fundamental about the jet age before anyone else did. Speed kills accuracy. In World War II, aircraft flew at 300 miles per hour. At that speed, a human pilot with good instincts could estimate lead. He could look at a German fighter turning in front of him, guess how far ahead to shoot, and pull the trigger. It was an art form. It relied on Kentucky windage and gut feeling. But Draper looked at the numbers for the coming jet age. 600 miles per hour, closing speeds of 1,000 miles per hour. At those velocities, the geometry of an intercept changes faster than the human eye can transmit data to the brain, and faster than the brain can transmit a command to the hand. By the time a pilot sees the enemy and decides to shoot, the enemy is already gone. Draper realized that asking a pilot to calculate ballistics at Mach 0.9 was not just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. The pilot didn't need a better gun, he needed a partner. He needed a machine that could predict the future. The project was codenamed the A1 series, eventually evolving into the A4 gun sight. But to the engineers, it was simply the sight. The heart of the device was not a microchip, those didn't exist yet. It was a gyroscope. But not just any gyroscope. Draper had perfected a technology called the floated integrating gyro. Imagine a small, precision-machined spinning top, suspended inside a can filled with a thick, molasses-like fluid. This fluid dampened the vibrations and shocks of a fighter jet. It allowed the gyro to sense the tiniest movements of the aircraft with absolute purity. Here is how the American magic actually worked, the secret the Soviets were desperate to find. In a traditional sight, the crosshair is fixed to the glass. Where the nose points, the crosshair points. In Draper's sight, the crosshair, the pipper, was not fixed. It was disturbed. It floated. When an American pilot banked his F-86 Sabre to follow a turning MiG-15, the gyroscopes inside the sight would feel the G-force and the rate of the turn. They would physically move the reflection of the reticle on the glass. The sight would drift the reticle away from the enemy plane. This sounds counterintuitive. Why would the sight move away? It was a psychological trick. To get the reticle back onto the target, the pilot would instinctively pull the stick harder, turning the plane tighter. By chasing the dot, the pilot was unknowingly forcing his aircraft into the perfect lead angle. The sight was doing the calculus. It was measuring the turn rate, the air density, and the ballistics. It was saying, if you want to hit that MiG, you need to be aiming here, at this empty patch of sky. The pilot didn't have to guess. He just had to obey the dot. But there was one missing variable: range. To solve the ballistic equation perfectly, the computer needed to know exactly how far away the target was, down to the foot. In World War II, pilots had to twist a dial on the throttle to match the wingspan of the enemy plane. It was slow and prone to error. Enter the AN divided by APG-30. This was the radar the Soviets had found. But they were wrong about what it did. It didn't fly the plane. It didn't see through clouds. It was a small, simple range-finding radar located in the nose lip of the Sabre. When the American pilot closed in on a MiG-15, the radar automatically locked on. It fed the precise distance, say 1,200 feet, directly into the gyroscopic computer. The result was a closed-loop system of devastating lethality. The gyros measured the turn, the radar measured the distance, the computer calculated the spot. All the American pilot had to do was fly the airplane so that the glowing orange diamond was resting on the silver fuselage of the MiG. He didn't have to lead. He didn't have to guess. He just put the thing on the thing and pulled the trigger. It turned average pilots into snipers. It turned good pilots into aces. While the Soviet pilot was wrestling with a vibrating optical sight, frantically doing mental trigonometry, trying to guess how many plane lengths ahead to shoot while his blood drained from his head under 5 Gs, the American pilot was playing a video game. The technology was so advanced for its time that the US Air Force was terrified of losing it. This explains the scorched earth policy. Pilots were briefed that the sight was more valuable than the airframe. The specific manufacturing of the floated gyros required tolerances of 1/1,000,000th of an inch. It was a manufacturing capability that the Soviet Union, for all its heavy industrial might, simply did not possess in the 1950s. The contrast in philosophy was stark. The Soviet philosophy, embodied in the MiG-15, was build a hot rod, big engine, big gun, simple controls, rely on the pilot's aggression. The American philosophy, embodied in the F-86 Sabre and the A-4 sight, was build a weapons system, integrate the man into the machine, remove the guesswork. The Soviets were looking for a robot plane. They didn't realize they were facing the first true cyborg weapon of the Cold War. The F-86 pilot wasn't a passenger, he was the biomechanical actuator for Dr. Draper's math problem. But there was a catch, a flaw in the system that the Soviets, in their paranoia, failed to exploit. The A-4 sight needed time to settle. When the pilot yanked the stick, the fluid in the gyros needed a fraction of a second to stabilize. If the flight was too erratic, the reticle would bounce off the glass. The Americans knew this. They trained to fly with a specific smoothness. Squeeze the stick, the instructors said. Don't yank it. They flew with a fluid grace that the sight rewarded with perfect accuracy. The Soviets, observing this smooth flying, assumed it was arrogance. Or they assumed, as we saw in Part 2, that the robot required a stable platform. So, the Soviets ordered their pilots to fly violently. They ordered the shake, and in doing so, they played right into the hands of the American machine. By maneuvering violently, the Soviet pilots bled off their energy. They slowed down, and the moment they slowed down and settled into a predictable turn, even for a second, the American radar would lock, the gyros would settle, the dot would drift onto the target, and the Sabre pilot would unleash a burst of 600 rounds. The mystery that baffled the Kremlin was simply a triumph of systems engineering. It was the realization that in the modern age, the most dangerous component of a fighter jet wasn't the cannon or the engine. It was the black box that told the pilot where to point them. But the secret couldn't stay hidden forever. The war dragged on. More Sabres were hit, more crashed, and eventually, the inevitability of war caught up with the Americans. One day, a Sabre went down. It didn't burn, it didn't explode. It bellied into a soft sandbank on a tidal flat, the tide coming in to gently cover it, preserving it like a specimen in a jar. The pilot was captured. But this time, the recovery team arrived before the American bombers. They attached cables to the submerged jet. They pulled it free. And inside the cockpit, the glass was cracked, but the black box was intact. The gyros were still floating in their oil. The Soviets finally had the source. They crated it up and flew it directly to Moscow, to the design bureau responsible for gun sights. The engineers gathered around, crowbars in hand, ready to crack open the American ghost. What they found inside would not just explain the slaughter in MiG Alley. It would force them to confront a terrifying reality about the technological gap between East and West. They were about to look into the future, and they wouldn't like what they saw. The wooden crate sits in the center of a sterile, high-security room at the NII-17 Research Institute in Moscow. It is late 1952. The room is filled with the Soviet Union's brightest minds in optics, ballistics, and radar. The atmosphere is thick with a mixture of professional curiosity and existential dread. They pry the lid off. Inside, cushioned by American packing material, is the electronic brain. It is damaged, but it is whole. The recovery team had dragged the F-86 Sabre out of the mud before the salt water could corrode the delicate internals. Now, under the harsh glare of laboratory lights, the Soviet engineers begin the autopsy. They strip away the outer casing of the Arni centimeter sight. They expect to find something alien. They expect to find a secret weapon, perhaps a miniaturized nuclear battery, or a guidance system stolen from German 5-2 rocket scientists. What they find instead is a shock that is far more profound than any wonder weapon. They find a level of manufacturing precision that simply does not exist in the Soviet Union. As the lead engineer disassembles the gyroscopic unit, he pauses. He places a component under a microscope. He calls his colleagues over. They take turns looking. There is silence in the room. The shock isn't that the technology is magic. The shock is that it is perfect. They are looking at the heart of Dr. Draper's invention, the floated integrating gyro. The clearance between the spinning rotor and the housing is measured in microns. The fluid suspending the gyro is of a specific viscosity and chemical composition that the Soviet chemical industry has never produced. The wiring is woven with a delicacy that resembles jewelry making more than military-industrial production. The realization hits them like a physical blow. The Americans didn't win MiG Alley because they had better pilots. They didn't win because they had faster planes. They won because they had better machinists. The mystery of the ghost bullets wasn't a tactical trick. It was a symptom of a widening chasm between the two superpowers. The Americans had mastered the art of mass-producing precision instrumentation. They were putting laboratory-grade physics experiments into the cockpits of thousands of fighter jets, treating them as disposable commodities. The Soviet engineers report their findings to the Kremlin. The report is stripped of the usual propaganda. It is blunt. The device calculates the lead angle automatically using radar inputs. It reads. It creates a solution so fast that the pilot acts only as a servo mechanism. Stalin's reaction is predictable. He does not want excuses about manufacturing tolerances. He does not care about microns. He slams his fist on the desk. "Copy it!" he orders. "Screw for screw. Wire for wire, make it look exactly the same, and put it in our MiGs." This order sets in motion one of the most frustrating chapters in Soviet aviation history, and it is here that the reveal turns into a tragedy for the Soviet pilot. The Soviet industry mobilizes to clone the American A4 site. They designate the copy the ASP-4 Newtons. On the outside, it is identical. It fits into the cockpit of the new MiG-17 fighters, just as the American sight fits into the Sabre. It has the same glass, the same dials, the same radar connection. But when they start building the internals, the reality of the Soviet command economy crashes into the reality of high-precision engineering. To build the floated gyros, you need dust-free rooms. You need temperature control stable to within a fraction of a degree. You need metallurgy that is free of even the microscopic impurities. The Soviet factories are vast, powerful beasts designed to churn out thousands of tanks and simple, rugged tractors. They are not watchmakers' shops. They rush the production to meet the quotas set by the party. They substitute materials where the American alloys are unavailable. They accept tolerances that are good enough for a tractor, but fatal for a computer. The result is the ASP-4 Newtons sight, a zombie clone of the American masterpiece. It looks like the American sight. It hums like the American sight. But it lacks the soul of the machine. When the new sights are rushed to the front lines and installed in the MiG-15 and MiG-17 aircraft, the pilots are initially ecstatic. They believe they finally have the magic eye. They believe the playing field is leveled. They take to the skies. They engage the American Sabres. They lock the radar. The reticle appears. And then, It drifts. The Soviet copies of the gyros are not perfectly balanced. The fluid is not pure. Under the heavy G-loads of combat, the delicate internal mechanism rubs against the casing. The floating effect is lost. The reticle on the glass doesn't move smoothly. It jumps. It wanders. It lies. Imagine the horror of a Soviet pilot in 1953. He is diving on an F-86 Sabre. He trusts his new electronic brain. He puts the pipper on the target. He fires. The shells miss by hundreds of yards. The sight tells him he is on target, but the physics of the cheap copy are betraying him. He tries to correct, but the sight lags. It is noisy. The radar signal fluctuates, causing the aiming point to jitter wildly on the glass. The pilots return to base furious. "The box is broken!" they scream. "It tries to kill us!" The maintenance crews try to calibrate them, but you cannot calibrate away a fundamental lack of precision. The reputation of the Soviet copy collapses overnight. The pilots lose faith in the technology. They start turning it off. They reach up and physically cage the gyro, locking it in place, turning the advanced computer back into a simple, fixed piece of glass, a glorified crosshair from 1945. They go back to using Kentucky windage. They go back to guessing. Meanwhile, across the valley, the American pilots in their F-86 Farads, Sabres are flying with the original article. Their sights are humming perfectly. They are confident. They trust the machine. The shock for the Soviet Union is total. They realized that they could steal the blueprints. They could steal the object itself, but they could not steal the industrial base required to build it. They were trying to race a Ferrari with a tractor engine. The confrontation reaches its climax in the final months of the war. The skies over Korea are filled with the new F-86 Farads, Sabres, now operating as a fully integrated weapon system. The kill ratios skyrocket. Some sources claim the ratio reached 10-1 in favor of the Sabre. While historians debate the exact number, the trend was undeniable. The MiG-15, aerodynamically superior, was being slaughtered. The Soviet generals watched the reports with grim resignation. They realized that the Americans have opened a new front in warfare. It is no longer just about horsepower and armor thickness. It is about information. The American sight was processing information, speed, range, angle, density, faster than a human ever could. The Soviets were still fighting a manual war in an automatic age. In a desperate bid to counter this, the Soviet design bureaus pivot. If they cannot win the electronics war, they decide to double down on the one thing they do better than anyone else: brute force. They begin sketching plans for aircraft that are so fast, so high-flying, that no computer can calculate a solution in time. They begin work on the MiG-19 and the MiG-21. They decide to run away from the problem rather than solve it. Speed is the best armor, they tell themselves. If we fly at Mach 2, their little gyroscopes won't matter. But deep down, the engineers at NII-17 know the truth. They know that this mystery in Korea was just the beginning. They have seen the future inside that wooden crate. They know that eventually, the computers will get faster. The missiles will get smarter. And if the Soviet Union cannot master the art of the electron and the gyroscope, they are doomed to lose the Cold War before it even truly begins. The American source was not a weapon. It was a warning. And as the guns finally fell silent over the Korean peninsula in 1953, the legacy of that little black box was just beginning to take shape. It would drive the Soviet Union into a frantic, paranoid technology race that would eventually bankrupt their empire. July 1953. The Korean War ends in an uneasy armistice. The roar of jet engines over the Yalu River fades into silence. The pilots go home. But in the classified archives of the Kremlin and the Pentagon, the war over the data is just beginning. The final scorecard of the air war is a subject of intense debate to this day. American propaganda claimed a kill ratio of 10-1,792. MiG-15 aircraft shot down for only 78 Sabres lost. Modern historians, with access to Soviet archives, suggest the number is lower, perhaps 4-1 against Soviet pilots and closer to 1-1 against the Chinese. But the raw numbers mask the true verdict. The real victory wasn't in the body count. It was in the psychological trauma inflicted on the Soviet military-industrial complex. The mystery of the A4 site planted a seed of doubt that would grow like a cancer for the next 40 years. It proved that in the modern age, superior aerodynamics, the curve of a wing, the thrust of an engine were no longer enough. The MiG-15 was, by all accounts, a better flying machine than the F-86 Sabre. It could fly higher, it accelerated faster. In a pure contest of energy, it should have won. But it lost. It lost because the Americans brought a computer to a knife fight. The failure of the Soviet copy, the ASP-4 Newtons, had a devastating ripple effect. It forced the Soviet Union into a reactionary posture that they never truly escaped. Instead of innovating their own path in microelectronics and precision computing, they became obsessed with theft and imitation. They spent billions of rubles building networks of spies to steal Western technology, only to find themselves unable to manufacture the designs they stole. They were like a cargo cult, building wooden replicas of radios and hoping for the music to play. They could copy the shape of the microchip, but they couldn't copy the purity of the silicon. They could copy the gyroscope, but they couldn't replicate the fluid. This imitation trap defined the rest of the Cold War. You see it in the Tu-144, the Concordski, which looked like the Concorde, but was louder and more dangerous. You see it in the Buran space shuttle, a copy of the American orbiter that flew only once. The incident in MiG Alley was the first clear signal of the Soviet Union's ultimate demise. Their economy was built for gross tonnage, millions of tons of steel, thousands of tanks, vast concrete dams. It was an economy of giants. But the future of warfare belonged to the midgets, to the transistor, the micro-switch, and the floated gyro. The Soviet system, rigid and quota-obsessed, simply could not handle the delicate cleanroom requirements of the information age. The F-86 Sabre and its secret sight marked the death of the Knight of the Air. Before this moment, the fighter pilot was a warrior poet, a man of instinct and reflex, the successor to the cavalryman with his sabre. He looked with his eyes and killed with his hands. After this moment, the pilot began his slow transformation into a systems manager. The A4 sight was the great-grandfather of the modern heads-up display. It was the ancestor of the aim assist algorithms in the F-35 Lightning. It was the first step toward a world where the plane flies itself, and the pilot is merely the vote in the loop, deciding when to authorize the kill. Today, if you walk into the National Museum of the US Air Force, you can stand next to an F-86 Sabre. You can look into the cockpit. It looks cramped, analog, almost antique. The famous A4 sight looks like a simple piece of junk metal and glass. But if you look closely, you are looking at the pivot point of history. That small black box didn't just shoot down MiG-15 aircraft. It shot down the Soviet doctrine of brute force. It proved that the most powerful weapon in war is no longer the biggest gun. It is the smartest chip. The pilots of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps went to their graves remembering the zone. They remembered the impossible shots, the traces that seemed to curve like magic, and the terrifying realization that the Americans weren't just fighting them, they were calculating them. The mystery was solved, but the lesson was fatal. The Soviet Union spent the next 4 decades chasing the ghost of American technology, running a race they had already lost in the skies over Korea in 1951.